Storyteller's Thread, a monthly podcast devoted to young adult literature and the art of storytelling. I'm your host, Sean Connors. On each episode, we invite an author for young adults to take us inside their work, and in doing so, to talk about their writing process, their inspiration for writing for young readers, and the general ins and outs of earning a living as a professional storyteller. So, whether you're a compulsive reader, an aspiring writer, a teacher or librarian, or simply a frustrated reader who's counting the hours until you get home and dive back into that novel that's waiting for you on your nightstand, this is the place for you. Hello, it's April 1st, 2020, and oh, what interesting times we find ourselves living in. With the coronavirus pandemic escalating, the global economy teetering, and many of us quarantined to our homes for an indefinite period of time, I don't have words to describe what I imagine many of us are probably feeling right about now. It's unlike anything I, or anyone for that matter, has experienced, and to say that the last few weeks have been stressful is an understatement, I know. That said, wherever in the world you're joining us from today, I hope that you and your loved ones are well, and I hope this podcast can be of some small service to you, even if only as a form of distraction. So let me distract you, or more appropriately, let us distract you. My guest this month is the New York Times best-selling author, Kiersten White. Born and raised in Utah, White studied English literature at Brigham Young University and graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in 2004. 6 years later, in 2010, she published Paranormalcy, her first young adult novel and the first volume in a series of the same name. In the decades since, White has been nothing short of prolific as a writer, publishing, on average, nearly 2 books a year. In addition to her original stories, she's also well known for adapting classic stories from a female perspective, prompting Kirkus Reviews to dub her an acclaimed master of the female-centric retelling. In the Conqueror Saga, a gender-bending trilogy that retells the story of Vlad the Impaler, White reimagines one of history's most ruthless figures as a woman, Lotta Dracul. A self-declared Frankenstein fangirl, she adapted Mary Shelley's classic novel in 2018, retelling it from the perspective of Elizabeth Lavenza, Victor's cousin, and an otherwise minor character in Shelley's novel. That same year, The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein received the Bram Stoker Award for Superior Achievement in a Young Adult Novel. In 2019, White published The Guinevere Deception, a feminist retelling of the Arthurian legend and the first book in a planned trilogy, the Camelot Rising series. That same year, she published Slayer, which is set in the universe of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. A second book in the series, Chosen, came out earlier this year. Are you beginning to see what I mean when I say that she's prolific? It was a pleasure to sit down with White, who lives in San Diego, to talk about her superhuman work schedule, her interest in literary adaptation, and her motivation for using feminist retellings of well-known stories to explore the inner workings of power. I hope you enjoy our conversation. My understanding is that it's generally good practice to begin an interview by asking a few questions to sort of break the ice and get the conversation started, and I do generally try to do that, but I'm going to make an exception this afternoon, and I'll tell you why. Virtually every interview that you've given, in which I've come across, seems to begin with the person you're talking to sharing an observation about your seemingly having superhuman powers. You're a mother, you're a writer. Not only do you write and mother, but you publish voraciously, in some cases putting out 2 or 3 books a year.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow on top of all of that, you find time to travel and speak and lecture. So I'm going to cut to the chase and just ask, on behalf of all of us mere humans, what is the secret to success?
Well, in my case, I have very high anxiety.
Do you?
I do, but I have managed to weaponize that anxiety and make it work for me. And so, I discovered from a very young age that my brain likes to worst case scenario, right? And it likes to play through these worst case scenarios over and over and over again. And I learned that if I fed that part of my brain stories instead, then instead of picking apart my life and all of my choices and all the things that I'm afraid of, I could just feed it a story and it could do that with the story instead. So, you put the characters in these situations, what could happen? Okay, change one thing, what happens then? Change one thing, what happens then? What if they have this conversation? What if the conversation goes this way? So on and on and on. And I've done that ever since I was a child. And so for me, telling stories and writing those stories and engaging with stories is what keeps my brain functioning. And so it allows me to create those stories very quickly, and because I do tend to get obsessive and sort of lose myself in those worlds. And it's nice too because I have that part of my brain to sort of let it be constantly going in the background, which then allows me to be fully engaged and present with my children and, more or less with my everyday life. I make a big effort with my husband and my children. Everybody else kind of comes and goes. Um, but yeah, it's just kind of telling stories has been a lifesaver for me. It's very important. It's a huge part of who I am. And I feel really fortunate that I've been able to make a career of it. And as far as the other things that go along with that, the traveling and the speaking, like those are all things that I really enjoy. I love connecting with other readers, other people who enjoy that same thing, who enjoy losing themselves in stories. It's a tremendous honor. So I'm really lucky in that I actually enjoy every single aspect of my career. I like drafting, I like editing, I like promotion, I like public speaking. I don't like wearing makeup, so that's the one problem. Is I have to very carefully schedule. Like I owed a couple of promotional videos to my Brazilian and Spanish language publishers, and I was like, oh man, okay, I got to schedule in one day this week where I have to look like a person. So that's the one downside. That's the one downside they don't warn you about when you get into writing is sometimes you have to look like a person.
Yeah. A distinct occupational hazard, right?
True, true.
I think your answer to my question is really fascinating. And I ask that in all seriousness because considering the frequency that you do publish and understanding the time commitment and the discipline that's necessary to maintain the level of productivity that you maintain, I mean, it's very clear that storytelling is woven into your DNA.
Mm-hmm.
And you've said in interviews that that's in part attributable to the home environment that you grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
You've talked about the fact you grew up in a really literacy-rich household.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I did. And it's interesting to me looking back because my parents, neither of them finished college. They got married fairly young. My dad got a job. My mom had a baby, and so they didn't finish college. But it was never. And it's interesting too because I grew up in a community where women are not necessarily encouraged to work. Actually, you're discouraged from working. You're supposed to stay at home and have kids and take care of those kids. But my parents, that never reflected in what they did. My mom was really, really engaged in the community, even though none of her kids had any issues or struggles with reading. She recognized a need within the area, and she set up an I Can Read literacy program for all of the elementary schools in the entire area that we lived in. Not just her own kid's school or her own kid's school district, but the whole community. And that's always been really amazing to me because it wasn't a personal issue for her. It wasn't something that any of her 5 children struggled with, but she knew how important having access to books and to stories and being able to read with confidence was. And so she figured out how to volunteer and give that to an entire community of children. And so yeah, it was a huge priority in our house. I was a voracious reader. My parents never discouraged that. They always bought me books and really encouraged that love of reading. And it made a huge impact. I talked to a lot of young readers who want to be writers and who say, did anybody encourage you? And in that, I always hear that they're being discouraged from doing that. And it makes me really sad because I am very fortunate in the way that I grew up. Everybody encouraged me. My teachers encouraged me. My parents encouraged me. There was never any sense that reading was a waste of time or that writing and creating stories was an avenue or a career that was inaccessible and one that I shouldn't focus on.
And you've attributed your upbringing, as you've described it, to your desire to write, to tell stories.
Yeah, yeah.
When you first began entertaining the idea of writing for publication, not as a childhood dream, but as a legitimate career that you were considering embarking on, did you know early on that you wanted to write for teenagers?
It was a process. So I always knew that I wanted to write for younger readers. I thought I was going to write middle grade. My first book that I actually wrote from start to finish was a middle grade novel. Fantastically boring middle grade novel. Just genuinely impressive how boring I made it. But it was a big leap to going from I'm going to write a book to actually writing a book because it was scary.
Hmm.
I had always told myself that I was going to be a writer. It was always my plan. But as long as you say I'm going to be a writer and you haven't actually tried to write a book, you can't fail because you're not doing it. And so finally actually sitting down and deciding I'm going to write a book from start to finish and I'm going to see what happens. It was very intimidating. And that first book took me a couple of years to write. And then I started looking into, how does one get published? How does the publishing industry work? You need to get an agent if you want to publish with the major publishers. And in the process of doing that, I realized that this phenomenally boring middle grade novel was never going to work. And in the meantime, I read a little book. You might not have heard of it. It's called Twilight.
Oh, yes.
This was in the heyday of Twilight, and I was a stay-at-home mom. My husband was in law school. I had a beautiful toddler and a beautiful baby, and they were both nightmares, especially the baby. And my mom gave me a copy of Twilight for Christmas. And I will say, I recognize that Twilight contains some inherently problematic content. But when I read that book for the first time, it was such just giddily, mindless escapism. And I loved it. I had so much fun reading it. And I was coming off of a degree in English literature where you read the same books that everybody else reads, and most of them are by dead white men who were writing about the same basic things, and reading had become a chore in a way during my process of getting my degree. And so to get back to remembering reading can just be so much fun was really a sort of a reawakening for me. And I also loved the series of unfortunate events and Harry Potter and the Redwall series and all those things. And so Twilight was really what made me think like, oh, this is something that I could do. This is something that would work with my voice. And so that, I think, was the moment where I decided I'm going to shelve trying to write middle grade for a while, because I honestly, and I still believe this, middle grade is much, much more difficult technically to write than young adult.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
In what sense?
Making a story that is engaging and accessible for younger readers, knowing that you have certain limitations in the type of story that you tell and the way that you tell it and the language that you use, but still crafting something that feels original and fun and engaging. Like it is, I just honestly believe middle grade is so much more technically challenging than young adult or even adult. And picture books are the hardest of all. Everybody thinks they can write a picture book.
True.
But actually making a 32-page book that is charming and accessible and worthwhile is almost impossible. So I moved on to young adult, and that was when I just realized this is it. This is what I'm going to do. The first young adult novel that I wrote was so much fun. I was able to get an agent for it. I immediately wrote a sequel, which is a really bad idea. Never write a sequel to a book that hasn't sold yet. Pro tip right there. And that book didn't sell. And so obviously the sequel also did not sell. But at that point, I knew this was it for me. But that failure allowed me to then say, okay, I'm writing the way that I think that I should write. It didn't work. So I'm just going to write the way that I want to write. I'm going to write whatever I want, however I want, with as much of myself and my voice in it as I want. And that's what ended up selling. That was my first novel, Paranormalcy.
You've said that part of the appeal that writing literature for teenagers holds for you is the emphasis that the genre, and maybe that's not the right word, but the genre of young adult literature places on celebrating different ways of being strong.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I thought that was really interesting. I wonder if you could say more about that idea.
Yeah, so I'm interested in telling stories almost entirely about girls, because those were the stories that I wanted and craved when I was growing up and very rarely got. If you did get a strong girl in a story, she was the only one. And so her role was to be the girl. It's like, Leia Organa is an incredible character, but she's also literally the only girl in the entire galaxy. So she has to be everything. And so one of the things that I really genuinely love about young adult literature is it is written, the vast majority of young adult literature is written by women. And it's a very, very um, female-dominated arena of publishing. My agent is a woman, my editor is a woman, my publicists are almost always women. The president of my publishing company is a woman. And I love that. Like professionally, I feel tremendously fortunate to be surrounded and mentored and supported by these incredibly insightful, powerful women. And I love that. And I love telling new stories. And I feel a lot of freedom within young adult to do that. Nobody ever says, well, why isn't the boy more the focus of the book? Actually, I do get asked that sometimes, and I shut it down pretty fast. Yeah, I've had somebody say, "What about the boys?" I'm like, "The boys get every other story. They're going to be fine." So I really love, and I'm saying love a lot. I really love what I do. I'm very passionate about it. But one of the things that writing in young adult literature allows you to do is tell a variety of stories. And traditionally, when you got stories with strong female characters, they were strong in very typically masculine ways. They were strong because they were very physically capable, or they were the assassin, or they were really strong, or they were really good at ignoring their feelings. And that's not all the ways that women can be strong. Like, yes, that is the way that some women are strong. And I like those stories. I think they're interesting. In the Anti-Darken trilogy, I certainly pursued like masculine paths to power through Lotta. But I'm also just interested in the way that women are strong when we support each other. Women are strong when they're having to play into what people think that they are and should be in order to manipulate people in order to create safe spaces for themselves. I'm interested in the ways that women are strong when they connect with and network with all of the other women around them and use all of their differences together to form these communities of safety and power and protection. And the great thing about young adult literature and people who read young adult literature, because it's not just teens, it's also adults, but in general, people who read young adult literature are not married to genre. So, a lot of readers will say, a lot of adult readers will say like, oh, I only read thrillers, oh, I only read nonfiction, I only read celebrity memoirs, oh, I only read James Patterson books, in which case, good for them, there's a lot. But with young adult literature, they just want a good story. And people are just as likely to read a contemporary rom-com as they are to read high fantasy. And so it's given me a lot of freedom as a storyteller to jump from genre to genre and explore all of these different characters that I want to, and really deep dive into what are the ways that girls and women can be strong and how can we explore that.
And I have so many questions that I want to dig into about that very topic with you. But I also want to ask, as you were describing the types of stories that you write, one type you didn't mention that you're very well known for is your retellings of other stories.
Mm-hmm.
From The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein, which is an adaptation of Mary Shelley's classic novel, to your Slayer series, which is set in the Buffy the Vampire Slayer universe, to more recently your novel The Guinevere Deception, which is a reimagining of the Arthurian legend. What is it that appeals to you about adaptation?
It's funny because I never set out to become a retellings author. It wasn't even really on my radar. It's something that I've just sort of fallen into the last few years. I really, really enjoy it. And the thing with retellings for me is I'm motivated by sort of opposing feelings about a story. So take Frankenstein, for example. It's my favorite classic. I love it. I love Mary Shelley. She's just this badass goth genius who changed the world, changed the scope of and shape of storytelling as a teenager, which, yay, teenage girls. But it also really, really bothers me that even though she herself was this groundbreaking, dynamic, brilliant woman, she wrote this story in which the women are cardboard cutouts of people who exist to be victims. That's their only role in the narrative, is to be victims to the hubris and the arrogance and the lack of caring of the men around them, which was very reflective of Mary Shelley's own life. So I understand that. But it also makes me really sad that she couldn't envision herself as the main character in her own life. And she couldn't envision a story in which women were able to drive the narrative or even influence it in any way other than dying horribly. And so, I have those sort of opposing feelings about it. I love it, and it also really bothers me. And I feel the same way about the Arthurian legends. I studied them in college. I've done the Mallory and all those different adaptations, and they're fun, and I love all the retellings. But at the same time, women get the shaft in them. there have been some good retellings, some good modern retellings that address that. But for the most part, we focus on Arthur and we focus on the sword and we focus on the knights and the bros and them going out in the forest and fighting till they decide they're best friends. And we ignore the women. What else was happening in Camelot? And for me, what happens when that story ends? What's the collateral damage? What is happening to the people around this narrative? And so for me, retellings are about engaging with something that you're familiar with and that you love, but that you also find lacking. And that's what I think is really exciting about retellings. There have been a lot of retellings lately that I've just absolutely loved. Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik, which is a loose retelling of Rumpelstiltskin, which gives, power and choice back to, the nameless daughter who's, does she even have a name in any of the stories?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. She's the main character. She's the one it all happens to, and she doesn't have a name. And then you have also things like Julie C. Dowell's Forest of a Thousand Lanterns, which is a reimagining of Snow White, but it's heavily influenced by Julie's own Vietnamese heritage. And I love those too. I love these retellings that sort of reclaim these stories that we all know and change them to reflect other cultural backgrounds, other heritages, other traditions. And so I just feel like retellings are such a rich opportunity to engage with sort of these cultural touchstone stories. So you're working with something that people are coming to with a base level of expectation. And you can either build on that expectation or you can subvert it in really interesting ways, which is very exciting as a storyteller. And bonus, you have to do less world building. And I hate world building. Yeah. As far as the historical, with the Anti-Darken trilogy, which is a reimagining of the life of Vlad the Impaler, if he had been born a girl instead of a boy, that was just a matter for what if. I knew all that history. My husband and I have traveled in Romania. My husband lived there for a couple of years before we met. And I was listening to him tell the history of Vlad the Impaler and Mehmet the Conqueror. And as I was thinking about Vlad the Impaler and the things that he did and how he never backed down, ever, even when it would have made more sense and in the long run been better for his own people, he never backed down. And I just had this moment where I thought, well, it would have made sense if he had been a woman. Because even now, but especially historically, if you ever showed weakness, if you ever backed down, you were going to lose everything. And so just that spark of an idea, I just thought, well, that's a story that I want to tell. I want to tell a story of what if he had been a woman and she had decided to navigate the world and go for power in the same absolutely brutal, unforgiving way that he did. What would that look like? And that was a story that I was interested in exploring.
What you're describing makes me think of an essay I came across that you wrote in which you used a metaphor and you liken the process of adaptation to a conversation that you're having with the original source texts.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what you're describing now, that talking back to engaging in a conversation with that text.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's nice because, we view reading sometimes as passive, but I don't think it is. I think it's active. The writer is inviting you to engage with a world they've created for 300 or 400 pages. And, why shouldn't it be a conversation? Why can't it be a conversation? And retellings allow us to engage with these existing stories, but to also question them. To say, this is what the story is. Why is it this way? Why is this the story that we're telling? Why are we obsessed with telling King Arthur and his sword over and over and over again? What is it about that draws us, and what stories are we ignoring by focusing on that one?
We've talked a little bit about your adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And I was curious, in adapting that story, did you conduct research on Mary Shelley? And if so, what did you learn about her that interested you?
Yeah, I did. That was a fun retelling in that my research was Mary Shelley's life and then the actual book Frankenstein. And she had such a sad life. Oh my gosh, she just had so much loss from a very, very early age. Her mother died in childbirth, giving birth to her. Her father was this great liberal political thinker who was all about abandoning social norms. But when Mary fell pregnant at 16 to a married man, he kicked her out of the house. And so her entire life, her livelihood and her well-being was entirely dependent on very arrogant and very self-centered men. Percy Shelley was a terrible person, and I hate him, and I'm glad he's dead.
I was going to say, I wasn't going to get you started. I was going to avoid his name.
I have a whole monologue about Mary Shelley, and Percy does not come out well in it. But she was just so fascinating to me. The things that she did with grief and the ways that she she was able to support herself. My favorite fact about Mary, and people will turn this into a romantic fact, and I don't think it's romantic at all. After Percy Shelley died tragically in a boating accident, and his body floated to shore, and they burned his body, and Mary kept his heart in her writing desk, wrapped in the sheet of his poetry, which is pretty metal. She never remarried. And so a lot of people will say, like, oh, she was so heartbroken over the loss of the great love of her life that she never married again. I don't see it that way at all. I look at this girl who was beholden to her father, who never had enough money, and then she was beholden to her husband, who had an inheritance and could never make it work, and they were constantly running from his debtors, and they had children who died as a result of his capriciousness and his inability to handle money. And suddenly, she's no longer an unwed teenage mother. She's no longer a wife. She's a widow, and a widow is a perfectly respectable thing to be. As a widow, she had access to Percy's inheritance, and she could make her own money. And she did. She supported herself and her one surviving son for the rest of her life. And I look at that as she finally was able to find a position of freedom and a position where she could support herself and her son without having to depend on the mercies of the terrible men in her life. And so she never married because she was able to take care of herself for the rest of her life. And I just look at that and I think she was just an incredible person.
Well, in reading The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein, it's very obvious to me, listening to you, how Shelley's biography informs your writing of Elizabeth's character.
Yeah.
I came across an essay that you wrote for a blog that Barnes & Noble sponsors for teenagers. And in it, you make an argument that, as someone who's also really interested in Shelley and Frankenstein, intrigued me. And I'd like to see if I could get you to say more about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and specifically, you argue that the novel Frankenstein has endured because of a question it asks, that question being, what makes a monster? But then you go on to explain that in writing your adaptation of Shelley's novel, you wanted to explore another question. Who makes a monster? Can you say more about your interest in that question and maybe how you found yourself answering it in the process of writing your way through Elizabeth's story?
Yeah, absolutely. So all of my novels have a central question that I'm exploring. Some writers start with character, some writers start with plot. For me, it's a question. And if I don't have a central question, then I'm not going to write the book, because the question is what motivates me in the writing. And it's what I come back to when I'm in the middle and I've lost my way or I'm losing steam. I come back to my question and remind myself why I'm telling this story this way. So with The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein, it was who makes a monster. And in this case, if you've read the novel, I don't consider the creature the monster. I consider Victor Frankenstein the monster, which I think of in the original Frankenstein as well. I think that Victor Frankenstein is the monster. And so I wanted to explore, particularly as a white woman living in the United States, I wanted to explore this concept of safety and security, and how if you are in a position of safety, you look the other way and you allow these systems that harm people around you and that prey on the most vulnerable around you to continue to exist because they aren't preying on you. And one thing that I find really fascinating is if you look at white supremacist communities, they have women in them, and white supremacists don't like women. They don't take care of women, they don't respect women, but white women are above everybody else. And so these women cling to the peripheral of that society because they view it as safety. Because yes, the men in that society hate them, but they hate everybody else more, so it's okay. And so particularly, in the political climate and looking at the things that have been going on in the last few years, that was a question that was very, very much on my mind because, I'm very against white supremacy, but I have benefited from systems of white supremacy in our country and in our country's history. And if you are a white person living in our country, you have too. And at what point do you have to grapple with that? At what point do you have to say, no, I haven't done these things, but the fact that these things have been done, I've benefited from that. And what can I do to step away from that, to address that? Is it going to cost me something And am I willing to pay that price? And that was really something that I was interested in exploring with this narrative. Because Elizabeth starts out as a very selfish person by necessity. She has known tremendous suffering and she has known want, and then she's been given this position where as long as she does what she's supposed to, she doesn't have to suffer anymore. She's protected and she's safe. And so that for her is her only priority, is to protect this little space of safety that she has been granted. And the process of the novel is her realizing that by looking the other way, by enabling Victor, by teaching him how to do the things that he wants to do without any personal repercussions, she's culpable. Like, granted, she's not guilty, she didn't do those things, but she helped them and she aided them. And so at what point do you finally take accountability and say, I'm not the monster, but I helped create it and I've got to do something?
I'd like to bring the Guinevere Deception into our conversation because there's a number of parallels in the issues that you explore with Elizabeth and with the character of Guinevere.
Mm-hmm.
But before we talk about the book, for listeners who haven't read the book, would you mind giving them a sense of what it's about?
Yeah, so the Guinevere Deception is set in Camelot, in the heyday of Camelot. Arthur has taken the throne, and Guinevere comes to Camelot to get married, to marry him. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to recenter the narrative around Guinevere and make her not just the queen who exists to sort of slide around on the edges of the story until she falls in love and it ruins everything. And so in this story, Guinevere is not actually Guinevere. She's not a princess. She's a changeling who was sent by Merlin to be Arthur's sort of magical bodyguard, because Camelot is in the process of banishing all magic and moving beyond the magic of the past. But that means nobody there can recognize magical threats or address them if they're coming after Arthur. So Guinevere functions as sort of a magical bodyguard, and it has, a lot of my favorite tropes. You've got the fake marriage because they're both in on the secret, but technically they're married. You've got the princess in disguise. In this case, the disguise is that she is a princess, and magic and wonder. It was really fun for me after spending quite a bit of time in very dark narratives with the Anti-Darken trilogy and The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein, both of which have dark in the title, which always makes me laugh when people are like, I was surprised at how dark this story was. And I'm like, well, it's not like the fun descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein. It's not the cheerful walk of Elizabeth Frankenstein. Like it's right there in the title. So yeah, it's a very, I feel like it's a very sort of traditional Arthurian retelling in that it is set in Camelot. It does have all of these familiar characters, but I've changed the narrative by focusing instead on the women.
And you also, as I'm thinking about the book, you also explore, I'm thinking about what you said about it, the process of adaptation being essentially conversation with another text. And you explore that same parasitic relationship that you described between white men and white women, because over the course of the story, Guinevere finds herself being drawn to what life with Arthur has to offer her and the sense of stability that she can take from it, right?
Yeah, and I'm fascinated by power. It shows up in a lot of my books, the sense of power, who has it, how they have it, how they use it, how it's obtained. And so yeah, that is definitely a theme that I keep coming back to.
Were there particular versions of the Arthurian legend that you found yourself either turning to or maybe writing against that colored the characters and the story that you ended up writing?
Yeah, this is definitely a much looser retelling than the other ones that I've done. Frankenstein, I felt like had to be an incredibly faithful adaptation because there is just the one book. That's it. That's Frankenstein. And then when I was writing the Anti-Darken trilogy, I tried to be as faithful to the actual history as I could. So if you've read that trilogy, you know the history. I condensed some timelines. I cut out some historical figures just for the sake of the narrative. But overall, it gets very, very accurate to what actually happened. And so it was kind of a relief with this retelling to realize there is no canon. You can't say this is the Arthur legend because it has always existed as stories that we participate in. So, you had somebody say, hey, there was maybe a Welsh king in the 5th century who fought a battle. I'm going to write a poem about that. And you had somebody else say, oh, I liked that poem. I'm going to write another poem about that. And somebody else saw that poem. They were like, oh, I like that poem. I'm going to write an epic and I'm going to introduce 2 other knights. And somebody read that and they liked it. So it's just on and on and on through the centuries. It was basically just like tag teaming. People would pick up somebody else's version and they would like it, so they would add stuff, or they wouldn't like it, so they would change stuff. And I mean, Lancelot didn't come in for several hundred years, and you had some versions where Mordred is his half son, like his son slash nephew. You had some where he wasn't those things. You have, and I mean, they're a mess. They're a glorious mess, but oh my goodness, there's a mess. They're just a mess. There's two knights named Yvain. There's Yvain and Yvain the Bastard. So like they were really running out of creativity toward the end, I think. Like, here's Yvain and his brother, Yvain. And so I felt a lot of freedom to just sort of say, these are the archetypes of Arthurian myth, and these are the ones that I want to play with. And otherwise, other than some references and maybe some influences, I just made my own. And that's the fun thing about Arthurian legend, is because it is such a broad, massive, sprawling mess of stories. You can go super faithful, or you can go, I'm taking Arthur and I'm taking the sword and I'm taking this and this and this, and I'm not worrying about anything else. And anything goes.
Freedom can definitely be a good thing, but it can also be a dangerous thing if you have too much freedom and no guidepost that you're working toward. And so I'm going to steer here into terrain that you've already suggested is uncomfortable for you. I was wondering, because the legend is so wide open and because there's so much territory for you to explore, that had me thinking about what the process of world building must have been like for you. Because unlike, let's say, Mary Shelley's novel, you're building a world that didn't exist and that you're literally taking from scratch, from the ground up. So I was curious, what was that experience like for you? And what kind of challenges did the world building pose for you?
Yeah, world building is definitely something that I have to force. It's something that I've learned as a writer. If you read my first series, the Paranormalcy trilogy, at one point Evie, the main character, gets out of this government center that she's been raised in, and she goes to Virginia, and that's it. That's all I ever tell you about it. There's like trees and a pond, and there's some houses, and like that's it as far as
sounds like Virginia.
Exactly. But that's the freedom of, I can say she's in Virginia and you have a general idea of what that means. But with the Anti-Darken trilogy, if I say she's walking down the street in Turgovich, do you know what that looks like? Not really. I do, but not what it looked like in the 15th century. And so I kind of cut my teeth on that, where I realized I'm going to have to treat this like a fantasy novel. I'm going to have to build this world from the ground up for people, because they're not going to have just a default sense of, what Edirne in the Ottoman Empire would look like, what a fortress in Hungary would look like, what they would be eating, what they would be wearing, what the rooms would look like, what wealth would look like, what poverty would look like. And so I really had to learn on that one how to build a world around my readers. And so fortunately I did do that, and I did the work, and so I was able to carry that forward. And so with Camelot, I just, at first I was like, oh, I'm going to root it in 5th century England. And then I started doing that research, and I was like, wow, I'm sure not going to do that. Because it would have been really hard. And I've already done historical fiction, and it was so much harder than I thought it was going to be. And so I just leaned into the glorious tradition of Arthurian anachronisms. Arthurian stories have always been anachronistic because they were told during the height of sort of this romantic period of knights and jousting. And so any Arthurian story that includes jousting, it's anachronistic. Because if you go by when the actual alleged Arthur would have lived, jousting was not a thing, that didn't exist back then. And so you've got all these little things that when we tell these stories, we think of them as during a very different era than they actually were. And so so I felt some freedom too. I was like, well, you know what, if there were anachronisms in here, I'll just say it's an homage to all the Arthurian retellings that have come before me. And so yeah, I just thought, what do I want to see in a fantasy world? I want to see a cool castle. What can I do with the castle that's going to make it stand out, that's going to make it interesting? I looked at, fashions from earlier than the 10th century. I would do research on what fruit did they actually have, what would have been reasonable for them to be eating, little details like that. But otherwise, that's the glory of fantasy, is when in doubt, you could just make it up. Which is why I always recommend to young writers, write fantasy, don't write historical fiction. Because if you write historical fiction, you're going to get it wrong, and someone out there will know.
I was struck by your reimagining of Camelot. In many of the versions of the story, I guess the anachronism that you're describing is that Arthur's kingdom represents a utopian ideal.
Yeah.
But that's not entirely the case in your book. To be sure, Arthur endeavors to build the perfect society, but in actuality, there are people in Camelot who are marginalized and excluded from it. And specifically, in your book, women who practice magic.
Yeah.
So I wonder, could you talk about your decision to depict Camelot as a place that's striving toward ideals, but that's also subject to prejudice and othering?
Yeah. So I'm sure you've heard the phrase, like, better for most people is always worse for some people.
Right.
So if you choose the thing that's the best for the majority of people, there's always going to be a minority that is negatively affected by that. And I wanted to explore that. I wanted to say, okay, so here you have a society that says we're going to go by laws and rules and justice, and we're going to make sure everything works the way that it's supposed to. But in order to do that, we have to get rid of chaos. And what is chaotic? Magic is chaotic. So we're going to root magic out of our society. And we're going to get rid of that. And if you look at the Arthurian legends, most of the people who practice magic, you've got Merlin, but then almost everybody else who has magic is a woman. And most of the time they're evil. They're either evil, like Morgan Le Fay, or they're just sort of these weird magical archetypes like the Ladies of the Lake who exist to serve Arthur and to help him out and then disappear. So like, even though they're these creatures of infinite power or whatever, they're just going to like give him a sword and help him set him on his way and then be fine. Actually, one of the weirdest stories that I came across in my research was there's some narrative where one of the Ladies of the Lake makes herself a ensorcelled chastity belt so that as protection against Merlin.
Wow.
Because he was such a skeeve and he was such a creepy predator that her only option for making sure she was safe around him was to make a magical chastity belt so Merlin could not get to her. And I was just like, dude, I mean, I don't even know if they realized what they were writing when they wrote that. Yeah. Like, okay, so Merlin's a predator. Cool. Anyway, weird stuff. And if you look at the actual narratives, like women suffer and women die as Arthur gets to power. And that was something that I was interested in exploring, because we look at chivalry as like, oh, they were so noble and they wanted to protect women. And this is something that I explore more in the future books. But when you say women need to be protected, you're saying women are inherently less powerful than men. You're codifying that. You're making that into rules and law. You're saying men are more powerful than women. And so I looked at magic as a very feminine way and a very feminine thing, and a thing that women have discovered and ways that women have used to find power, to protect and help themselves and each other. And so when you say Camelot can't function with magic in it, you're taking away something that is not going to impact the men, it's going to impact the women. And so I made the magic system in the Camelot Rising trilogy a very, very feminine magical system. I actually went to the Malleus Maleficarum, which is a handbook written in the Middle Ages by a witch hunter. And he was a terrible person, and it's a terrible book that was used as justification for murdering innocent women that people didn't like. It allowed them to accuse them of witchcraft and kill them. And it's the stupidest book. Like, it's just bonkers level stupid. I mean, my favorite anecdote from it is a man woke up and he looked down and his manhood was gone. And he realized it had to have been this witch that he pissed off. So he goes over to the witch's house and he apologizes and he makes it right. He's like, can I please have my body part back? And she was like, oh yeah, sure, here. And she gets down a bird's nest, and inside this bird's nest is a very wide selection of male body parts that she has taken. And she's like, go ahead and pick which one's yours.
Wow.
The implication being like, maybe he walked away with a better deal than he had before. So you have these stories and they're just so stupid, right? They're so stupid. But people believe this nonsense and they use it to persecute women. And one of the things that this witch hunter told people to look for was knots. Like, if there's knots tied in your horse's mane, it means your neighbor doesn't like you and she's cursing you. Or if you go up into your attic and there are ropes in your attic and they have knots in them, again, you've been cursed by your neighbor. Go ahead and kill her. And so I took that knot magic and I made it something else. I reclaimed it. I said, okay, the Malleus Maleficarum can't have this anymore because it's stupid and I hate it. And so I took that and I made it into a very feminine sort of magic where you're literally knotting control and power and protection into your hair, into your clothes, into your sewing, all of these things that women have and that women take care of for each other and for their friends and their family and their loved ones. It was just ways for them to sort of knot power into the world around them. And so that was a really fun, very personal, very practical, magical system to develop, inspired by something terrible, but reclaimed.
I have to tell you, maybe this is just me, I love to attend the first sentence in a book because I feel like it's just set so many expectations for what's to follow. And the opening line of the Guinevere Deception is amazing. And you write, there was nothing in the world as magical and terrifying as a girl on the cusp of womanhood. It is not often that you see an author essentially summarize and so succinctly a central ideology that underpins so many of her books, but I can't help but feel that's precisely what you've done here. Can you talk about the significance of that opening line for you? And in particular, do you think that in our culture today, we do perceive teenage girls as a combination of both magical and terrifying?
Yeah. That's one of those really special first lines that I sat down to start this book, and that was the very first thing that I wrote.
It just came to you.
Right
Wow.
out of the gate. Yeah, that was always the first line of this book. And it really was one that just kind of came to me in the moment. Like you said, it summarized everything that I wanted to do. And I do agree with that. I think our society is terrified of the power, particularly of teenage girls. And so as a society, we mock them. They have incredible power as far as like trends and making things popular, making things make money. But if teenage girls like something, then we dismiss it and we mock it and we ignore it, right? And so that's one thing that I look at the way that we dismiss the things that teenage girls care about and the things that matter to them and are important to them, the ways that we try to control them, to tell them what they can and can't be. And then also, find me something scarier than walking into, like, say, a coffee shop and there's a table full of darling teenage girls and they all look up at you at once and then they look back down at their phones and start laughing. Like, is there a more terrifying experience? Is there an experience?
No, I can speak. No.
Right? Like, nothing will make you feel smaller, faster than that. And I love that. I love that, it's a time of tremendous potential and upheaval and power. And so often as a society, we ignore that. And so, yeah, you're right. That line does sum up most of my books, and the things that I'm interested in exploring is the power of that very small time period where you're in both worlds. You're in childhood and you're in adulthood. You're not either thing. And because of that, you have the freedom to sort of be everything at once,
Yeah.
Which I find really exciting as a storyteller.
I have a colleague here at the University of Arkansas, Lizette Switke, and she specializes in adaptation. And we talk a lot, and we've been talking lately about a trend that both of us have noticed in young adult literature that involves writers adapting 19th century classic novels. And without naming specific examples, what we've begun to observe is that in many instances, the female characters in these books might as well be 21st century girls who've been transported back in time.
Mm-hmm.
They just unabashedly defy their society's gender conventions, almost to the point of, historically, it would have put them in danger.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, as you imagine her in your novel, and I think Guinevere as well, they're decidedly more complex characters. And I wonder, could you talk about how you approach writing them?
Yeah. That is one of the challenges of retellings is obviously you want to make it accessible to modern readers. You want them to engage with and care about these characters, but at the same time, like, how do you convey that they're not living in the same society? They do not have the same thoughts and ideas about things. And that was something that I ran into early on with the Anti-Darken trilogy, where I was trying to explain the politics of harems because, we look at them and we say that's inherently an evil system. It's bad. It's gross. And like, yes, it's not a good system. We shouldn't bring it back. I'm not advocating for it, but that's it's divorcing it from the context of the time period. And the context of the time period was much more complicated. Women within harems, particularly the women at the top of the harems, had tremendous political power and tremendous sway. And harems also offered women a certain degree of freedom. So let's say you lived in Constantinople and you were in a terrible marriage and your husband was abusive and there was no way for you to get out because you couldn't get a divorce, you couldn't get out of him. What you could do is you could leave your house and set foot inside the harem building. And once you were inside the harem, you were technically part of it and effectively divorced from your husband. And like, yes, you would have to live in the harem, you would have to be part of it, probably as like a servant or a maid, but it was a way for women to get to make some decision about their fate, some decision about their future. And so I really try to contextualize these things for the reader and say, like, let's not bring all of our 21st century viewpoints to this. Let's try and remember that, or like the veiling of the faces at the time period, it was a status thing. It was saying, my family is wealthy enough that I don't have to work, because if I had to work a manual labor job, I would not be able to wear a veil. Things like that. And so that's a sensibility that I've tried to carry on. So for like Elizabeth Frankenstein, I did research like legal issues for women of the day. One of my favorite pieces of research that I did was reasons why women were committed to asylums at the time. Like, what could get you committed to an asylum? And like you said, it would be most of the things that a lot of these female protagonists do in retellings. And so getting to, especially with Elizabeth, she was a really fascinating one for me and a really important one for me to write, because I did grow up in a community that had sort of gotten to 50s gender roles with women and were like, cool, full stop, we're just going to stay here. And so I learned very early on, if I behaved a certain way, if I talked a certain way, if I dressed and looked a certain way, I was going to get approval from the adults around me. And that was very important to me. And so I learned to hide the fact that I was very ambitious. I learned to never be angry. I learned to, when I was struggling with depression in high school, to fake it, to pretend like I wasn't. You're not supposed to be mad. You're always supposed to be pretty, all these things. And it makes you a very, very deceptive person. And it makes you a very manipulative person, because you learn how to say and look and do the right thing in order to elicit the safe response from other people. And so obviously, I looked at that as an extreme with Elizabeth, because it was an even more confining time for women, and particularly a woman in Elizabeth's position. But I tried to approach it very realistically, because, she's not going to like take up a sword and fight the Frankensteins for her birthright. She's not going to do those things because she couldn't have. I say this in a novel where a monster is created out of bits and pieces of other human flesh and animals. But, I do try to sort of ground these narratives in the reality of what they would have been. And so I give my characters these rules. I say, this is the world that they're living in. How could they move through that world and still find ways to have an influence, to make changes, and to create positions of power and safety for themselves and for the people that they love?
Just this morning, this is ironic, just this morning I sat in on a thesis defense for a student in my university's creative writing program, and she aspires to write young adult fiction. In the course of talking about the story that she'd written for her thesis, one of my colleagues, a female, shared a pet peeve that she has with books for teenagers that perpetuate the trope of girls either not eating or picking at food. Mm-hmm. And in that moment, I actually found myself thinking of in this conversation we're having and wondering whether, as a storyteller who writes books that feature strong female protagonists, but who also wants to honor the historical conventions that those characters would have had to exist with, I was wondering, do you have a list, and that's for lack of a better term, of pet peeves that you're aware of in fiction for teenagers in which you consciously aim to avoid reproducing yourself when you're writing these female characters?
Yeah. And it's really just one thing. Well, two things. One, I don't like it when we don't allow our characters to have flaws. And I get the impulse. You want to write this sort of every character. You want to write a girl that everybody can root for and believe in. But but by saying women can only be heroes and can only be main characters if they have no flaws, we're saying to the women in our lives, you only have value if you don't have flaws. So I like to create deeply flawed characters who are perhaps vicious, who are ambitious, to the detriment of the people around them, who are manipulative and secretive, who maybe don't always make the right choices, because it's important to me to say you can be a flawed person, you can have these sometimes negative character traits, and you can still be, the main character of your own story. And then the other one that really bothers me is when female characters in stories don't have complex relationships with other women. Where if there's another girl in the story and she's not the token best friend, they must necessarily be in competition. Like if they want the same thing, then they have to hate each other and they have to be in competition with each other. And that's actually something that shows up a lot in the Arthurian legends. If you ever have more than one woman, they hate each other and they're fighting each other. So in one version, Guinevere has a sister named Guinevere. Again, they were not creative with naming.
Struggling.
Yeah, they were really struggling with names. And Guinevere shows up at Camelot and tries to take over Guinevere's role. Like she tries to just like straight on slip into Guinevere's role in Camelot and take it from her. And so one of the things that I do in all of my books is I try to show how complex and varied and interesting and supportive and complicated women's relationships with other women can be, especially in the Guinevere Deception trilogy, because I did want to reclaim Camelot from all the dude bros. I created this cast of strong and interesting and strange women around Guinevere. One of my favorites is Dindrain. She's a little bit older. She's in her 20s. She's unmarried. She lives with her brother and his terrible wife. And on the surface, she's not a nice person. She's gossipy. She's mean, she's competitive, but because Guinevere has no reason to be threatened by her, Guinevere's just like, oh, I like you a lot, let's be friends. And that permission to be herself is life-changing for Dindrain. And the realization that someone could look at her and see a person of value and a person who is worth spending time with and getting to know, it changes Dindrain's entire narrative. And it doesn't make her a nicer person. She's still not a super nice person, but she's allowed to be who she is. And so, yeah, that for me, if there are no significant female characters besides the main character, that's a pet peeve of mine, because it's not realistic of reality. It's not a reflection of the world that we live in and the ways that women engage with and move through the world.
What is your role as a storyteller for young adults, do you think? Do you feel a sense of responsibility to call young readers' attention to cultural topics like sexism and gender inequality? Or is the presence of those topics in your books more attributable to your using writing as a vehicle to process and think through them yourself?
Definitely the latter. I feel like anytime you set out to write something to teach teens or to sort of evangelize at them, you're going to fail. It's not going to work because you're not writing a real story. You're not writing real people. You're writing, an ideology, and that doesn't work. It always comes across as false and forced. And I don't think I would be interested in it. All of the stories that I write reflect something that I personally am interested in and that I'm working through myself. Sometimes embarrassingly so. Sometimes I won't even realize it. Like when I was writing Slayer, I just thought I was writing this fun spin-off of the Buffy the Vampire Slayer story. And then as soon as I finished, I realized, oh, I wrote myself into this book. It's entirely about looking at the community that you grew up in and this world that you grew up in and you loved and you revered and you believed in, and then finally getting to a point where you realized, wait, there's also a lot of bad there and it's done a lot of harm to a lot of vulnerable people. How do I reconcile that? And that was completely a reflection of what was going on in my life at the time. So that was embarrassing. It's always embarrassing to me because it's like, if I knew that's what I was exploring beforehand, fine. But the fact that I can write an entire novel and not realize that I personally am working through whatever huge emotional upheaval I'm going through at the time, it's a little bit weird. And I comforted myself by saying, oh, it happens to every writer. Every writer writes a book, and it's not until the book's done that they realize what they were writing. But then I was talking to Lainey Taylor, who's a good friend and honestly, I think a genius. And I mentioned that to her, and she's like, "Really? That's never happened to me." And I was like, "Gosh dang it, Lainey."
I was going to say, it can't be very comfortable to have all of your, I guess, psychological baggage hung out for the world to see.
Yeah. I mean, but bright side is I don't think most people pick up on it. I think in most cases it is personal enough that they're not going to realize it. But yeah, I mean, I write for myself first and foremost. Obviously, I feel a responsibility when writing for teenagers. I feel a responsibility to include hope in my books because I am writing for teenagers about teenagers and they have their entire lives ahead of them. So I really like to emphasize the fact that like it doesn't matter how bad you mess up, you have not ruined everything. You can't ruin everything. You still have so much life and potential ahead of you. So no matter how dark my books are, I always try to include an element of hope. And then I also try to reflect the diverse realities of the world around us. That's really important to me that teens can see both themselves and people not like themselves in the books that I write, and see that all of these narratives and all of these ideas have value. But other than that, no, I don't ever try and like, this is the book where I'm going to teach teens about feminism. And I don't think they need it. Teens are so smart, man. They're scary. I have two teenagers, and the things that they care about, the things that they're aware of, it's astonishing, and they're really incredible.
What can people look forward to from Kiersten White in 2020? Are there projects you're working on or books that you have soon to be released that you can talk about?
Yeah, so coming this fall is The Camelot Betrayal, which is the second book in the Camelot Rising trilogy. So the sequel to the Guinevere Deception. It's done. I'm very excited about it. I take Guinevere out of Camelot and into the wider world around her, where she meets some old friends and some old foes, and maybe foes who were friends and should be or shouldn't be. That was really fun. I'm currently almost done drafting book 3, which has been really an interesting process, and is making me sad because I don't want to say goodbye to these characters. Which usually when I get to this point, I'm like, get these characters away from me. but in this case, I'm actually sad. And then I have, speaking of retellings, I have a Romeo and Juliet short story retelling coming out in an anthology of Shakespearean retellings called That Way Madness Lies, which is edited by Talia Adler. And I think that's coming out early 2021. Other than that, I'm really just kind of trying to decide what to do with my life because for the first time honestly, I think for the first time since 2009, I don't have multiple books under contract. Once I finish Guinevere 3, I have nothing else under contract, so I can really be thoughtful about what I want to do next, which is so exciting and really just absolutely paralyzing.
Something tells me that you'll have maybe 5 or 6, maybe in the next 2 months, ready to present.
Here's hoping.
Well, thank you so much for making time for me. I think the perspective that you offer in your books is so invaluable, not only for female readers, but I think for male readers as well. And I just so enjoy reading them.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
And that brings us to the end of this month's show. Thank you for being here. And thank you again to Kiersten for making time to talk with me about her work. If you aren't familiar with her books, now's the time to rectify that. What better way to while away the quarantine than reading The Guinevere Deception or The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein? Or why not both? As for me, I'll look forward to seeing you back here next month. Till then, be well and happy reading.